I'd like to wish everyone a very warm welcome to our third session, our third LinkedIn Live session on innovations in clinical trials. Welcome. We have some amazing panelists to have a great conversation today on the importance of diversity in the clinical trial setting. But before we get to the panelists, I need to inform everyone of some community guidelines for this conversation. We certainly look forward to your comments and questions in the chat. You all should have access to the chat line. We do need to remind you that we can't field questions on specific products or specific ongoing clinical trials. These need to be addressed with your physician or directly with the sponsor company in your home country. As I mentioned before, please put your comments or questions in the chat, and I will, as moderator, bring those questions and comments into the conversation. So let me start with a question. Why has this topic of diversity in clinical trials come to the forefront now? We certainly learned a lot about the importance of including a diverse patient population during the pandemic. But we also have known for some time that the overwhelming majority, something like 75 to 80% of all patients enrolled in clinical trials come from the European or Caucasian ancestry. And we know that Europeans and Caucasians only make up about 11% of the world's patient population. So we're doing something quite well enrolling Europeans and Caucasians, but we're not enrolling the full spectrum of patients who could benefit. And this is doing a disservice to those patients and the scientific information that we really need to know about how our products work in terms of safety and effectiveness for the enormous array of patients that exist in the world. So in today's session, we're going to have a conversation about why has these barriers, perceived or real, existed for so long in the clinical trial architecture, and what can we do to make diversity the norm in clinical trials. It's good science, and we need to, in service of patients, really attack this issue so that we fundamentally bring in a diverse representative patient population, and that we do it with ease, and that this becomes normal. So we have a wonderful panel today, and I'd like to start by inviting each of our panelists to give a brief introduction of themselves and to share why diversity in clinical trials is important for you. So I'd like to start with Dr. Joe Mikhael. Joe, over to you for a brief introduction and just one thing about why diversity in clinical trials is important for you.
Well, thanks so much, Michelle. It's just such a pleasure to be a part of this and to reunite with old friends and make new friends as we have this discussion. If I'm allowed to give two answers, I'm going to say it's personal and it's professional. So first of all, my name is Dr. Joseph Mikhael. I'm a hematologist. I'm a myeloma physician by training. I have the privilege of being the chief medical officer of the International Myeloma Foundation based in Los Angeles. And I'm also a professor at the Translational Genomics Research Institute here in Phoenix, Arizona, where I continue to do myeloma research and have a lab and conduct several clinical trials. This is a particularly important point, as I mentioned, both personal and professional. On the personal side, I'm of African-American descent. And myeloma, for those who may not be familiar with it, is a disease that is twice as common in African-Americans. In fact, we anticipate that 20% of all patients in this country, in the US, are of African-American descent who have multiple myeloma. And yet, the representation in clinical trials is typically 5 to 7%. So essentially a quarter or a third of what one would anticipate. And so professionally for me, this is clearly an area that is of tremendous disparity and of great concern. And I devote much of my career and work to trying to enhance and improve the outcomes of African Americans with multiple myeloma, because it's not just a function of poor representation in clinical trials. We know, sadly, that survival outcomes for African Americans are roughly half that of white or Caucasian Americans. So I feel that this topic is one piece of a much greater challenging puzzle that we have to fix within the health disparity of multiple myeloma. So that's why you're going to sense some passion from me during this discussion, because this isn't academic to me. This is real to me personally and professionally.
Yeah, one could argue even that the poor access has its roots in the not being included in clinical trials. Now over to, I'm going to drop the doctors after the introductions, but with great respect, over to Dr. Alexandra Goodyear. Brief introduction and why diversity is important.
Thanks, Michelle. Much like Joe, I also have kind of personal and professional reasons for this. I'm a neurologist by training, and my subspecialty is in multiple sclerosis. And I worked both on the academic side, having a clinic and running clinical trials academically, and then prior to joining industry some years ago. And I continue to work in the MS space, doing drug development now on the industry side. But my first job in healthcare was actually as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was a health education volunteer in West Africa. So I spent 2 years. It was my first time in hospitals and clinics was actually in Senegal. And so I come at this really from a global health equity place, where that's long been my passion. So it's now so nice to be in industry and have it means to really be able to affect change. And also having, much like Joe described his expertise in multiple myeloma, in multiple sclerosis, we see very similar patterns where the prevalence in the African American or Black and Latinx populations is as high as in the Caucasian population. But in our clinical trials, kind of historically, we've seen across industry, representation of Black patients is approximately 2%. So we have a big gap that we can work on. So that's what drives me to this place too.
Great, thank you. And now to the one and only Dr. Edith Perez.
Thank you, Michelle. A pleasure for me to be with all of you today, covering this hugely important topic. You know, many people have talked about the challenges. So when I think about how are we going to improve the status quo, so why is this important to address your question? Well, I can summarize it probably in 3 to 4 points. I believe, based on data, that lack of representation in clinical trials, compromises the generalizability of clinical research findings overall. It may hinder innovation. It may lead to lack of access to effective medical interventions. And last but potentially, as important as anything, it may actually compound health disparities in the populations currently underrepresented in clinical trials, which will continue to undermine, the important trust that we need to provide health equity for all people, around the world.
And maybe I'll do an introduction for you, Edith. For those of you on the call that don't know Edith, she's been a clinical investigator, a longtime cooperative group primary investigator, and has joined industry several years ago. And we're blessed to have both Joe, Alexandra, and Edith here to share their clinical experience, because while running clinical trials is something that they all do, they each have treated patients, and so I think can really speak to the barriers. But anything else you want to add there, Edith, that I missed about your background that's important?
Yeah. One, thank you for remembering who I am. That's one. And number two, I'm just passionate about realizing the value of science for patients. So my my academic research started actually with lung cancer, then moved to breast cancer, and then it evolved into how can we use precision approaches to identify patients who are most likely to respond to various therapies. And now it's also a matter of access. So we can do a lot of research, but we need to be sure that our innovations are accessible to many people around the world.
Very cool. Well, so audience, so what you've heard is we have panelists here who have treated patients with hematologic malignancies, with solid tumor malignancies, as well as a number of diseases in the immunological space. And what'll be interesting is if the barriers are similar or different across these disease areas. But so let's start with that then from the patient perspective. What do you all find stops a patient from finding a way, a path to join a clinical trial that could improve their outcomes? And I'll hand it over to you, Joe, first.
Sure. So I think one of the reasons why a topic like this is so important is that we can't try to pretend that there's some simple solution, that if we just did A, then everything is going to be fixed. And so I can't help but answer a question like this in saying that it's inordinately complicated, and it ranges from structural issues right down to the clinic. So it is a problem that is entrenched in our society. And if we're going to find a solution to it, which I hope as our conversation goes, we're going to be discussing different potential solutions, because I actually do inherently believe that it is possible to reverse many of these challenges that we're facing. But this is essentially entrenched in systemic issues of systemic racism. There are issues that have in history that have unfortunately brought us to where we are. And although we can't change history, we recognize that we have opportunity to right some of that wrong and to take us into a different direction. It's also embedded within so many social determinants of health, right? And one of the reasons why you mentioned, Michelle, at the start, that we've been so successful in recruiting a certain population to clinical trials is because the clinical trials have sort of matched the lifestyle of a small fraction of individuals within our countries and the planet. And so being able to step back and say, okay, well, what are those challenges inherently? And those challenges are numerous, that include socioeconomic status, access to basic insurance, let alone access to clinical trials, inherent trust within the system, and then the logistics, frankly. And I'm sure we'll be talking about this more as we go, but the very logistics. We have clinical trials that are designed and created and put together without a thought of diversity until the very end. It's like baking a cake and at the very end saying, oh, I need cherries in this cake. Well, it's too late, right? Unless you involve cherries at the very beginning of maybe I'm hungry, even though it's early in the morning. If you haven't thought of that from the very start, then it's not going to be an issue later. And so if we're not thinking about this concept in the very design of the trial, let alone saying at the very end, oh, let's facilitate transport, or, let's have materials that reflect the diversity of the population we're trying to reach, that has to be done from the very start. So to me, the essential barrier from the very start is things that are embedded in the systemic society, things that are embedded in medicine in general, and things that are embedded within the logistics of how we conduct clinical trials. And I do think those barriers are overcomable, but we've got to look at each of them in turn before we're going to be able to see more patients access this great innovation that Edith was talking about. I mean, in my world, in myeloma, we have never seen the kind of revolution we're experiencing now with novel therapies. And my passion is to ensure that everyone has access to them.
Absolutely.
Michelle, may I add to this really important question that you posed? To me, there are essentially three components, from the patient or the person with the disease, standpoint that limit accrual. Number one is that they need to be approached related to availability of clinical trials. So physician plays a big role to introduce the concept. Number two, it may be that there is no clinical trial that is available where the patient lives or close to where the patient lives. So that is a barrier, a second barrier. And number three, for us to continue with general education related to the value of clinical trials for individuals and society in general, so that when a person is faced with a disease where a clinical trial might be helpful, this actually doesn't become a new concept. It's something that they've heard of before, so that they would like to be part of intrinsically because they already know that clinical trials exist. with the goal of improving the standard of care that we have today.
Thank you. And Alexandra, I'm going to drill a little bit down into this. So I know that our audience spans the globe. Some of them are regulators, some of them are in industry, some of them are in international countries. And one of the things that I think is underappreciated is let's say that a patient is approached. Let's say that a Black or a Hispanic patient or an Indian patient, that there's a clinical trial that's ongoing in near where they live. And let's say that they knew what clinical trials were. So it hit all of Edith's three things. But there was a study that was put together, and there were some inclusion-exclusion criteria that meant that they could not participate. Do some common inclusion-exclusion criteria that basically exclude diverse patient populations exist? And if so, what would be ones that you'd want to highlight to people that may be new to this area of criteria that exclude patients?
Thanks, Michelle. It's a very good question, and I think also highlights how important it is for this to be approached from a really cross-functional place, that there's, as Joe was saying earlier, there's no single solution that's going to fix all of this. So when we're looking at it, especially from the sponsor side, it really needs to include the clinical people that are writing the protocols, as well as the regulators and the operations team and how they're setting things up, and data collection and how is data collection gathered. Everyone needs to be aware and paying attention from the very beginning. For the clinical people writing the protocols, I think I think in order to try and standardize global trials, which is in and of itself a good goal, we moved to a place where templates started to be so heavily relied upon, and like inclusion-exclusion criteria are just always the same from one trial to another, even across different therapeutic areas. And we're starting to appreciate that may not always make sense and also can be excluding people. So important to note it's important to note the population that you're trying to include. And so if they have different reference ranges of normal for hemoglobin or hemoglobin A1C or creatinine clearance, that we need to be careful that by trying to create a homogeneous population, we might actually have restricted who's coming in at all. Mm-hmm. So I think that this is now being recognized. So those were a few that have come up, and I think important for those of us that are now writing protocols to push back where appropriate. I mean, always keeping patient safety in mind, but maybe really testing our comfort levels and making sure that we're being inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other top 10 inclusion-exclusion criteria to call out for people's awareness? BMI is one that I'm aware of. Any others that folks would add to the list?
Well, I would just emphasize what Alexandra just said. Like, in our world of myeloma, as I mentioned in particular, myeloma is twice as common in African Americans. Mm-hmm. Well, we look at two of those key exclusion criteria that were mentioned, which were the creatinine clearance and whether it's hemoglobin or even a white count often is an issue. So when we look at African Americans, that there is a greater preponderance of renal insufficiency in myeloma patients if you're African American, and also anemia. Part of that is sadly because there's a delayed diagnosis and there's more advanced disease by the time it's discovered, but it's also because of confounding diagnoses like diabetes. So diabetes is much more common within the African American community at large, which is also one of the reasons why the diagnosis is delayed, because patients don't come in with a sign on their head saying, I have myeloma. They have signs and symptoms, and very often it's just passed off as being diabetes. So in our explicit exclusion criteria, if we're too restrictive with renal insufficiency, if we're too restrictive with diabetes parameters or with cytopenia parameters, we're clearly excluding people. And I just want to emphasize, I'm not saying it's unimportant, but let me suggest that the inclusion criteria part of this issue of diversity within clinical trials, which always seems to be the first question that gets asked, and it's appropriate, is perhaps 1% of the problem. This is a tiny piece of the massive puzzle. I mean, I have been doing myeloma clinical trials for 25 years and have sought to be as inclusive as possible. This issue does come up, there is no doubt, but it is a small piece of a massive problem where, as you know, many of the issues that we've identified before, be it trust, access, systemic challenges, the whole perception of trials, are greater issues. Not to minimize this at all, Michelle, but
no, I think it's a really good. I think it's
we fixed our inclusion criteria, therefore we're good.
Yeah,
that's just a tiny piece.
Yeah.
I think that's what's one of the great things about having this conversation is we can add that detail, right? So we do have people from Senegal, Singapore, Switzerland on the line. So talking about that 99% of solutions that we know exist, Edith, has there been a positive case that or positive action that you've taken that has significantly shifted the ability of diverse patient populations to be involved in clinical trials?
Yeah, Michelle, I must, address something, if you allow me, to the previous question, barrier, because we usually don't talk about this, but actually our trials, particularly in hematology oncology, are more and more geared towards abnormalities within the tumor. So patients need to come in knowing if they have a particular alteration, a fusion, a mutation, and there's an issue with next generation gene sequencing in underserved populations and in different parts of the world. So if individuals have not had their tumors analyzed in terms of gene profiling, then we may not find that they're eligible for studies. And this is an issue that is beyond social determinants of health. It's an issue of healthcare not being, administered the similar way in different populations. So I just wanted to touch on that issue. In terms of solutions, I'm really proud to work with so many people over the years on this issue. And the latest one has been, my participation in the national academies of science, engineering, and medicine, where we worked on a congressionally directed project to actually address this issue that was in the United States and hopefully applicable throughout the world. And we came up with a report just this May, just 3 months ago, where we analyzed the issues, and we came up with some specific recommendations that address individuals, patients, institutions, the regulatory agencies, as well as funders of clinical trials and payers, all of these issues. So we were very specific with the recommendations that could be considered at the individual and the national and regulatory areas to help solve this problem. So I think, referring to that National Academy's report could be a way to be structured related to solutions.
And we'll make sure to provide a link to that report because that report is publicly available, right, Edith?
Yes. Yes.
Cool.
Michelle, can I add to that?
Yes.
Because I think what is happening is Edith has made reference to one document, but now there have been several. From the AACR, from the FDA, from many others. There are clearly best practices in this area that have been developed. And where I have seen greater success, if you will, and it's hard to define the word success, but where we've seen, improvements in this, I would say is if I am an entity that is about to run a clinical trial, my advice to them would be that there's a philosophy and there's a pragmatism. So the philosophy is to be intentional from A to Z, or seeing as we have a worldwide audience, from A to Z, right? So that we are looking at every step along the way. Am I considering the significance of diversity and inclusion in this clinical trial? From the very development of it to the actual pragmatic running of the trial. So philosophically, am I thinking about that every step of the way? And then pragmatically, what does that mean? That means patient inclusion and community engagement from the very start, before you've actually finalized the protocol. Are you getting input and insight from a diverse population, both from the investigator standpoint and from the patient standpoint who's going to be touched by this? Has that influenced and been infused appropriately into your protocol? And then at every step along the way, very often guided by a diversity officer, I would argue that clinical trials should all have a diversity officer who is with them every step of the way to help guide and carry it out. And then pragmatically speaking, I can tease Edith a little bit because she and I were both at, Mayo Clinic for so long. But looking here in the US, for example, we need to stop thinking that all of these major clinical trials have to be done at the Mayo Clinics, Memorial Sloan Ketterings, MD Andersons. No disrespect to those institutions. They're marvelous. But we have to start thinking about why have we not had more trials in geographical areas where these patients are. In the US, 82 to 83% of all African Americans live in 18 states. And many of those states are not well represented in Louisiana, in Alabama, in Mississippi, places like that where we're geographically doing that. And then right down to the specifics of the logistics of the trial. Are we providing transport for these patients? Are we providing elder care or child care for these individuals? Because we've heard what are some of these barriers for individuals to come in. Why are we so exclusionary in insurance coverage? We try to build our budget so carefully. What's the standard of care and what's on the research side? And a lot of those standard of care things are not going to be covered by certain populations. And so I could go on and on about this forever, but that's why I summarize it with the philosophy of saying, am I intentionally wanting to include from day one? That may take more effort. That may take more time. That may take more money, frankly. We have to be committed to this issue. And then pragmatically at every step along the way, am I following those best practices that we've referred to? Am I have community engagement? Am I selecting the right sites? Am I training our physicians in culturally sensitive care so that, as Edith said, they're raising the issue of clinical trials in the right way? Have I built trust in that community? And not just because I want to have a clinical trial done. I know we'll come to talk about this when we think about patient advocacy organizations. Because if it's just about your trial, people aren't interested. If you're really there for their better outcome, for their health, for their neurological health or oncological health, as we're focusing on today, then there may be an interest. But if you're there just with a cape trying to descend and provide some super clinical trial and then disappear 2 years later when the trial is done, there's no point arriving. If anything, you're going to make the problem worse.
Yeah, let's talk about those patient associations and that community. Alexandra, I think you've had a recent experience engaging with a patient association, and by no means is one experience, the experience that always is, but maybe take us into that world. And if we want to build those trusted relationships so that it's not just about our clinical trial, what are some best practices that you've encountered?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize what how meaningful that partnership is with advocacy, because especially from the sponsor side, of course, it's harder to connect directly with patients so that they can really help us understand what are the barriers, what are those specific communities needing, and help us really appreciate how healthcare is local. That even when we're trying to solve these problems, that to try and do it on a national or international level, maybe you may miss the mark entirely. So understanding what is the healthcare like in that specific state, in that specific community. And of course, when you're conducting global clinical trials, that's a very hard thing to do. And I think also I really liked what Joe was saying about it being a philosophical approach and also a pragmatic approach, that I think even recently, within the last couple of years, what we were seeing was that this work, when successfully done, was being driven by individuals or small teams. But then, as Joe points out, then you're kind of in and out, and that doesn't really work. So you need really, and what I think is really exciting about now and where we are now is that we're starting to see the philosophical approach being really embraced by companies, so that it's kind of, you're getting both the top down and the bottom up coming, so that because these problems are too big for a small study team to be able to solve on their own. So when you have company commitment and like partnering with advocacy, partnering with the medical associations, then you're starting to get that philosophical approach with like, this is how we need to do research. And then you can also then incorporate the pragmatic things, but you're not asking a small team on one study to be able to address all of these issues by themselves. And I think that's a really exciting place to be. Okay. And I think also we can use, I think the connecting with advocacy groups can be so important for taking in insights and also being able to communicate out. So they can really be a portal on both places, so that I think we can't rely on advocacy to do so much for us. So I think that what I'm seeing now, which is really exciting, is that there can be a real back and forth, where sometimes what resources they create can be things that we amplify on the sponsor side, and vice versa, especially when we're creating non-branded materials about what is a clinical trial, and making sure that that has a kind of inclusive approach to it. The advocacy can use that, because maybe they don't have time to develop their own videos on what is a clinical trial. So I think this partnership and the amplification that can happen with that is really exciting.
Alexandra, Michelle, I wonder if you allow me to add a couple of examples, if I may, related to patient groups and advocacy. And this is from personal experience. I volunteer time as much as I can, but specifically with two groups. Number one is the Donna Foundation, based in Jacksonville, Florida. We started a breast cancer marathon some years ago, and the idea here is to raise funds to help underserved women, particularly, and their families, so that they can have access to go to their sites for treatment. So when they're undergoing therapy, can we help them with some financial resources so they can actually go to the clinic appointments? And that is really important as part of participation in clinical trials. Mm-hmm. The second example is I'm honored to be the chair of the Health Equity Committee for Stand Up to Cancer. And what we've done there is that we've actually changed the criteria that we utilize to fund applications, as we've included 3 components related to health equity as part of all of the grant reviews that we do. Number one, the study needs to propose and plan to enroll the patients that are commensurate with the patients who suffer from the disease, number one. Number two, we want to be sure that they have not only inclusion criteria, but also methods to retain patients into clinical trials. That is number two. And number three, addressing something that Joe mentioned, which is involvement of a health equity person from the institution, stating that they support that investigator to be successful in the clinical trial. So these are very concrete examples that I hope can be helpful to everybody, and they are available in the internet.
Thank you. Stand Up
Michelle,
to Cancer.
I can't help but jump in here, right? I mean, of course, my disclosure is that I am the Chief Medical Officer of the International Myeloma Foundation, right? So for those who see the title IMF, I don't work for the International Monetary Fund, right? I work for the International Myeloma Foundation. I'm not part of some elite Tom Cruise force, but an impossible force. But even before I joined the IMF, I knew the value of these organizations. But now that I'm obviously part of the IMF, I see it so much more, because Alexandra said it beautifully. No two communities the same. And part of the historical problem of clinical trials is we build this sort of cookie cutter and expect it to work in every place. Mm-hmm. And what we need in the community is embedded trust, embedded understanding of, well, not just a general concept of what clinical trials are, but to connect to people. For example, at the IMF, we'll have 160 support groups across the country. And if a clinical trial is going to come to one community, then that support group is going to be inherent for the success of that clinical trial, because they will be facilitate this linking. And I loved how Alexandra said this partnership that there is between industry and the patient organization, where we can work together, because we have been working in community engagement to build trust, to build an understanding, to connect the right patients to these kinds of clinical trials. And I think the role that these organizations play is more than just generic advocacy and generic information. It really is that direct contact. I mean, we have an info line, for example, where people can call every day. It's remarkable how many people call and say, my doctor mentioned this clinical trial, but I don't know, what does Dr. Joe think? What does the IMF think? And it's that reassurance, because, and sadly during COVID, there was an erosion of trust of clinical trials and of the pharmaceutical industry and others in general, because there was this fear that things were being done for ulterior motives and ulterior purposes. And so we can help with that and have people understand how much clinical trials have had an impact in the diseases in which we treat. And so I'm really thankful that you've asked this question, hopefully not just for personal reasons because of the work I do at the IMF, but because I have seen the tremendous amplification and multiplication of clinical trials through the work of an organization like the IMF or these ones that Edith has mentioned, because it really is part of the process. And again, I go back to what I said before. You don't wait till the last second to say, oh, who can we plug into to make this happen? This has to be from the very beginning.
Yeah. So we have about 1,000 people live with us here, and we're getting questions coming in from the chat. So a question from Nitzala in Germany, and she or he wants to know, how do we encourage inclusion of countries that aren't dominated by the Caucasian population? How do we support building clinical trial infrastructure in non-Caucasian countries? Anybody want to take that one?
I'm quite passionate about this, so I'd love to take that. I think it's such an important question. And I think it also gets to not only how do we build the infrastructure so that trials can take place, but appreciating that clinical trials helps build the infrastructure necessary in order to be able to use these medications later. That without the infrastructure and the practice of trials, how are physicians supposed to get the experience? How do you have the right technologies there, the right MRI machine, the right infusion suite? But the trials help set that up so that when drugs are approved later, patients can actually get access to it. So I think trials are a really important step towards access. And in terms of how do we do that, Joe has spoken a bit about, and Edith as well, about the financial burden of trial participation and how important it is for sponsors to maintain aware of this from the beginning. So not just we'll reimburse you later, although reimbursement is great. At a minimum, like reimbursement is really important, but can we do better than that? And I think some of the innovations I've seen recently are making sure that patients never have to come out of pocket, because maybe you can't even come out of pocket to pay a babysitter to get to your clinic or to get into an Uber to get there. Maybe even like that is too much. So how can we make sure that you're setting up a system that patients never come out of pocket so that there's no financial burden? And once you're setting that up as a standard for the whole trial, then things start to become easier to implement globally. So that But Joe, I'm sure you.
No, I mean, there's so much. Like maybe we could do an hour on this answering this one question, Michelle. But let me just briefly add. I think the point that Alexandra made is quite sentinel, of saying that trials can actually be a bridge and a start towards more equitable care in that individual country. I'll give you an example. I'm working with a group of Latin American countries right now. Some of whom have almost no experience in clinical trials, other with rather extensive experience. And we've created almost like a cooperative group among them, a network among them, a Latin American myeloma network. And the concept here is there is very poor access to a lot of very important drugs in these countries. And what we can do as a cooperative group would maybe not be able to be done by an individual country, where we can now work with sponsors to say, let's do a clinical trial. And it may not be the most, if you will, scientifically a brilliant clinical trial answering some massive question, as much as almost like an expanded access like trial, where these individuals can get access to the therapy, the doctors get comfortable using it, the country is benefiting in large. So everybody benefits from this. But those trials are going to be conducted there. It takes a dedication from the sponsors to say, and one sponsor, for example, we were speaking to recently said, from the top down in our company, we've said this is a priority for us to reach those who have historically not been reached. We recognize it's going to cost more. We recognize it's going to take more time to build this. We recognize the infrastructure is not there, but we have to do this. That may be, if there's one line I want to leave with you today, we have to do this. We have to. And it's a shame on us that we've not. The paradox here from this brilliant question from Germany is that in a lot of our oncological studies, at least, Alexandra, I can't speak for the neurological ones, very often we do clinical trials in, if you will, low middle income countries, because those are the countries where these new drugs haven't come yet. And so we have the patient population to be able to do these trials, but they've historically been done in Caucasian countries in Eastern Europe and other places. And so now it's time for us to say it's not just about trying to get, a scientific signal of does this drug work in people who haven't been exposed to all the other drugs that have been developed. Now it's about saying where are the areas in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in the Middle East, all over the world where we really need to provide these opportunities to individuals, and slowly building that infrastructure. You don't start with some ginormous trial. We start small, but I think it's very doable. But it begins, and I sound like I'm redundant, but it starts with the philosophical as well as the pragmatic approach, saying, do we really want to do this? If we do, there is a method to do so.
Yeah, yeah. And another question from England, which has to do with basically how do you embed clinical trials into clinical practice, normal everyday clinical practice, and as we talk about this, I'm curious your thoughts on that. So how do we do research the other way around, instead of separate but embedded, but also to reach these countries or populations? Like, how do you come in and help build the infrastructure without it being like colonialism or like this is the way you need to do it? Are there any thoughts on that, Edith? Any?
Yeah, I think there's some, a basic infrastructure that is needed for clinical trials. Certainly the individual suffering from the disease, that's number one. Number two, to have a research team that understands the value of the clinical trials. And then you need a medical record system. You need a way to keep the data safe and accessible. You need to have some kind of laboratory facility or access so that the appropriate tests or radiologic tests can be performed. And then if it's related to drugs, you need a pharmacy system that allows for the receipt and keeping these agents, and then being able to make the agents accessible to the patients. And then the last issue is to have research personnel. It's actually more research personnel beyond the physician, because you need a coordinator, you need data management. So I think if we structure the basic needs for a clinical trial, this is something that can be shared with different sites. And these are not kind of top-down things. These are just usual things that we need for all clinical trials. And that is different than having an apheresis unit or complex things, that may be needed for a specific clinical trial. But there's some basics that I think we can help others. And I'm give you another example. I have the honor now to be the chief medical officer of a very small biotech company called Biotherapeutics. And we have to think about, where we, activate the clinical trials. And even in a small company where we're mainly doing phase 1-2 trials, we're thinking about this issue. How can we be efficient, but how can we be inclusive in the context of efficiency as we conduct these trials, not only in the United States, but other parts of the world?
Mm-hmm.
No, and if I could just very briefly add to that, I'll be brief this time, I promise, that I think the essential pieces that Edith mentioned are so fundamental, and they're not as daunting as they might appear. There's some trials that are only going to ever be done in massive academic centers because of the complexity of it. But we are seeing clinical trials move out into the community, and I think that is particularly important. I happen to now work in a center where I'm in an academic group nested in a community hospital. It's been transformational for me to see that. To see that you can open a clinical trial. It doesn't take 9 months. When I used to teach Edith when I was at Mayo, it was like a pregnancy. It took 9 months, and we were inducing labor at the very end to make it happen. We could do things more simplistically in the community. So this is feasible. This is doable. Not every kind of clinical trial, but that basic infrastructure is not so impossible to embed into a smaller community setting.
Yeah, cool. I want to get to like digital and machine learning and all of that, but we do have a couple questions from the chat, which I think are highly relevant. You know, we've been talking about race and ethnicity in terms of diversity, but there's a question for you, Edith, from the USA, Kristen, about what's being done to improve access for women in trials instead of men. And then a question for Alexandra. Good practices to follow, but as how do we embed GCP? Is there a need to evaluate the GCP regulations as it pertains to clinical trials in diverse settings? So, Edith, men and women in clinical trials.
Yeah. Actually, this is one of the areas that has improved over the years. You know, we've looked at the data from the NIH. We've looked at the data from industry as part of this National Academies project, and we've moved the needle, at least in the United States. I cannot speak really for other parts of the world on this really important issue, but there obviously the problems stand with access to education and etc. for women, beyond the scope of our meeting today. But even within women, the access to trials is different for Caucasian versus Latinx versus Black, and this is something we need to address. But at least from the women's standpoint, I think things are better.
And Alexandra, an answer to this question about good practices to follow. All right, let's move on then into the digital space. And if, Edith, you mentioned the need for access to electronic safe system that protects patient privacy. How might we include real-world evidence as a means to diversify our knowledge about a medicine?
Yeah,
Any
to
ideas
me,
there?
Oh, definitely ideas. Number one is to be thoughtful about this. It's up to us to do this the right way, and it's, in my view, it's more than a gimmick. But we have to be cautious not to think of including digital strategies as a gimmick or a new thing. Let's put it in. We have to figure out, if we have a device that we think may be relevant for a trial. First of all, do people have access to that device? How are we going to accurately collect data from that device that would allow us to really learn something from the specific clinical trial? So I'm actually very hopeful about this. At the same time, I'm a little bit cautious related to how much value are we going to derive with the expense if we are not thoughtful about the way we plan, not only how to do the trial, but also the data accuracy that we will get out of the experiment.
Any thoughts on anything to do with the digital space? Could be digital tools in the clinical trial architecture, or things that our audience would need to know about when it comes to insights gained from artificial intelligence.
I have go ahead, Joe.
No, go ahead, please, Alexandra, please.
I'm also hopeful in the digital space, because I think I remember even when I left my village way back when I was in Peace Corps, and I came back 2 years later, and the village had not changed at all in terms of still no running water, still no electricity, but everybody had cell phones. And that was amazing to me. And I think it creates the possibility of where some of our endpoints in our trials can put up barriers because of maybe you have to get to clinic and it's so far away, or you need to reach an MRI center. I have hope that if you have digital solutions or wearable devices or et cetera, that maybe all of a sudden those barriers could go away. So I think that those possibilities are really exciting. In terms of real world evidence and how that relates to the diversity and inclusive research that we're talking about today, I think that real world evidence is such a growing part of how we do drug development that we need to make sure that when we're doing real world evidence, we are also being inclusive, because I think the real world evidence data sets that are out there now are largely also Caucasian. So if we're going to be building out machine learning based on these data sets, well, we've excluded a huge population from the beginning. So I think it's something when we were, as Joe said at the beginning, this really needs to be end to end on how we're approaching this, and it's philosophical at every step. That includes real world evidence. We need to make sure that that includes the diverse populations also.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And oh, go ahead, Edith.
Oh, yeah, I mean, related to real world evidence, I mean, it goes back to the medical records that have been kept to be able to then extract the data. And in medicine, we don't have a structured way to collect medical information in medical practices in the US or throughout the world. And I think that's a challenge. At the same time, an opportunity for us to help with education so that we have some structured information that is captured in medical records so that we can then learn from real world data.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think, many of us see insights gleaned from real world data. And I would say to the audience, make sure you ask the question, what was that patient population that gave that insight? Was it wholly Caucasian, or was it diverse in its representation? And if it wasn't, can you really trust that hypothesis or that insight that's been gleaned? So certainly more for us to be aware of there. Moving to our last 10 minutes here, I want to throw it out to the panelists. Is there a topic that you think is really important for our audience to know that we haven't touched on?
I could jump in with one that when we talked about many of those best practices, one of them that we haven't had a chance to focus on, and trust me, there are like 12 others we haven't had a chance to cover. And just hopefully part of the discussion today just allows people to see that there is this tip of the iceberg concept, that there is so much to it. But I think part of it is also recognizing within our healthcare teams, Edith referenced the fact that, it takes a village, right, to run a clinical trial. And we have to really look at our own institutions and our own places where we're conducting trials and saying, does our team reflect that diversity? When a patient comes into the clinic, do they look around and see anyone who looks like themselves? Now, I want to be careful that we're not sort of setting artificial mandates or numbers, but we have shown, and there have been multiple studies demonstrating that people do have greater comfort and trust when they're being cared for someone that understands their background, and part of that is that they look like themselves. So we can recognize the importance of, if you will, growing a whole a field of individuals interested in clinical research from these diverse populations. And that involves from early on in medical school, from the medical side, from those who want to be on the research side of, what are our tactics in reaching out to this community to recruit people into these positions to begin with, to want a career in this, right? Why would someone want a career in clinical trials? Well, hopefully, as Edith said, that we recognize and we promote what clinical trials can really do, how they have revolutionized so much of what we have, why we've moved oncologic care and neurological care so much further, so that we're recruiting people within these fields, and then also recognizing that within our clinics. And, people can't necessarily change the color of their skin, or of course, of the race or ethnicity. But when I look at my whole team, does it reflect the diversity of the population that I'm treating? And furthermore, for those who are not, for those who are in the care of these patients, have they had unconscious bias training? Have they had the kinds of understanding and training that I think is we've known does have a positive impact in gaining comfort with the patient and trust with the patient, and ultimately recruitment to clinical trials?
Really important point.
I love this comment about unconscious bias training. I think it's important for people that are coming from the sponsor side to recognize how important our role is in education, that people are coming to this and are at very different stages in this kind of journey.
Can I interrupt you for just a second, Alexandra? Because I realize that in our world, we use this term unconscious bias. Maybe can you take a step back and explain what it is?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. That's a very good point. It's wow, I'm probably not the best person to do this, but it's kind of everything you bring and your assumptions that you bring that might actually be preventing you from seeing and appreciating the wider scope. And I encourage everybody, there's so many trainings available. If you haven't done one, please go. I thought for me, it was personally very illuminating on things I thought I was very good at. Turns out I have room to grow as well. And some successes I've seen that I was really impressed with this when I found teams that began talking about this from the beginning with their investigator meetings at the start of trials. And I think from the sponsor side, it's so important that we use our platform to be talking about this really transparently. And so ever since I saw a team doing this, I'm now encouraged, start talking about it day one. And if you talk about it and set it as a priority at your investigator meeting, then you start really rolling that out.
Cool. All right, we're in the lightning round now, and you can see the question here, the questions over here. So maybe in the lightning round, we can all glance over at the questions and see if, in a way, we can add some perspectives to the questions coming from the audience. But the lightning round question is one piece of advice you would give to those running clinical trials to make trials accessible and ensure that every patient gets a chance to enroll. One piece of advice. Joe, you're first.
Well, it's always hard to narrow to one, but I would say that you need to obtain input from experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion to guide you through the process. The part of the challenges here, we sometimes think we can do it on our own. We think we know the solution, but there are best practices, as we've said many times on this call. There are methods that have been successful. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Talk to people who have done this and have had success in doing this. Not that we've mastered it by any means, but there are some very basic things that can be included in the process that will build not only the credibility of your trial, but will ultimately lead to greater recruitment. So get help, find the right help to do this, because historically we want to kind of do it all on our own. But I think getting that help can have a huge implication.
Alexandra, one piece of advice.
My advice would be to appreciate how complex this issue is, and that in order to solve that or to make impact on it, you need a broad and cross-functional team. So I think you can get trapped in thinking, yes, if I write the protocol differently, or this is really an operations issue, but it's not, it's everybody's issue. And so the entire team working on the clinical trial, from the clinical, medical, data collection, operations, if all of them are prioritizing this and at least thinking about it, that will have impact.
And Edith, one piece of advice.
Okay. To me, it's optimizing the study team. That means, that this, again, as Alexandra said, it's not one person. So optimizing the studies team to ensure alignment with research goals, which includes anticipating and removing barriers to study participation.
Remove barriers. Cool. Great. Thank you all. As Joe so eloquently said, we have to do this now. It's just not okay for innovative medicines to exist in the world and not have it be available to every patient around the world, no matter their race, no matter their ethnicity, no matter their gender. They should have access. They should have that treatment available to them. And one of the themes that I think you heard is that clinical trial infrastructure and inclusion of all patients is really critical to building a healthcare system where these innovative medicines and amazing treatments can reach patients. So With that, I thank you all. This was a really wonderful conversation. I hope our audience enjoyed it too. We are planning another LinkedIn Live session in our series on innovative clinical trials. Stay tuned for information about the amazing panelists that will join us for that session, as well as more information on what that topic will be. But we hope that you continue to join us for these series of conversations. And with that, I thank our panelists and wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Do something today in that day that you have, or that work that you have, to make a difference and make sure that we are running clinical trials that are inclusive of everyone. You can make a difference.
Wow.